How about that for an introduction? A little bit different from the norm. That's the sound of the Éamonn Ceannt Céilí Band, founded in Ceannt, 14 Thomas Street in 1957. For me, the story of Éamonn Ceannt is remarkable for a number of reasons. As we'll hear today, I think he's arguably the definitive cultural figure of the 1916 story across language and music and much more besides. But his biography in the Dictionary of Irish Biography says he is probably the least celebrated of the proclamation's 7 signatories. And I think that depends on the world that you inhabit, because he was a founder of the Dublin Pipers Club, Cumann na bBríoirí, and his name is still revered today by those in the People Rialto and across traditional music more broadly. 10 years ago, during the centenary of 1916, Ceannt was arguably, one of the most celebrated of all the signatories. Pipers like Liam O'Flynn and Ronan Brown honoured him, and in the extraordinary way that Uilleann pipers honour one another, his own pipes are still played on occasion. In recent years at the Connacht Fleadh, for example, Uilleann pipes never belong behind glass. They are cherished things that live intergenerational lives. So Éamonn Ceannt's life is the story of music, but it's also the story of a really remarkable organiser, what I've called the quiet revolutionary. And it's the story of a resilient relationship, one that came out of the cultural moment. There's something deeply depressing about the account of the raid on the home of his widow, Anya Ceannt, that appeared in the Freeman's Journal in February 1923, a newspaper that did not share her politics and was very much on the other side of the Civil War, but seemed to recognise the horror in what happened to her. Every window had been smashed out. Doors were broken. Furniture of all descriptions was strewn about, broken to splinters. Photographs of Mr. Éamonn Ceannt, who was executed after Easter 1916, were destroyed. A number of shots had been discharged, as there were bullet marks through some of the windows and also in pictures. A collection of toys belonging to Miss Ceannt's son, who was in college, was also taken out and smashed. Doesn't that say something of the uncivil nature of the so-called Civil War? And Anya herself would spend time in Mountjoy prison during that conflict. That kind of destruction, those stories of friends turned foe, embody the bitterness of the conflict that came with the birth of the new state. By then, Anya was living in Ranelagh, but in earlier times, she and her husband resided at Dolphin's Terrace and Dolphin's Barn, where lore has it bayonet marks still visible from an earlier raid. Earlier again, they lived in 2 addresses on Rialto's Reuben Avenue and around the South Circular Road more broadly. And all of this puts Ceannt in the heart of an area he would come to know intimately well, the heart of the Irish Volunteers' 4th Battalion. It's not for nothing that the impressive park in Crumlin carries the name Éamonn Ceannt Park. In Chicor, Kilmainham, Rialto, Dolphin's Barn, Crumlin, Kimmage, all part of the area that Ceannt would oversee as an organiser. He was a committed trade unionist as well, and someone whose name was mentioned favourably on several occasions by both Larkin and Connolly, and someone who clashed on the question of class politics with Arthur Griffith, the founder of Sinn Féin. And Ceannt was a prolific writer. He published widely in the Gaelic League newspaper, in publications advancing traditional music, and in the Irish Volunteer. And what I want to do today is take him a little bit out of the shadows, I suppose. So with next week bringing the 110th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, it seemed a good chance to talk about one of its more overlooked figures, Éamonn Ceannt. Thank you so much for tuning in to this edition of the podcast. Still in that weird moment of moving house. Never made a podcast before off an iPhone hotspot, but we do what we can. Mila Buekas, as ever, a special thank you to all of those who support the podcast and keep it on the road. Enjoy this edition. For someone who would ultimately give his life in pursuit of an Irish Republic, it is remarkable, but not entirely unique, that Éamonn Ceannt was born, we might say quite literally, within the walls of the Empire in 1881. The son of a constable of the Royal Irish Constabulary, Edward Thomas Ceannt was born in an RIC barracks in Galway. And reflecting the nature of his father's position, the family moved around. James Ceannt was stationed in Drogheda for a period, before retiring in 1892, aged just 53, and relocating his family to Dublin. They first lived at 26 Bayview Avenue, Fairview, only a short walk from the North Richmond Street Christian Brothers O'Connell School. That one school would educate Éamonn Ceannt, Sean Euston, and Con Colbert, all of whom would face the firing squads at Kilmainham Jail in the aftermath of the Rising. But even more interesting than that, research, firstly by Brother Allen of the school in the 1960s, and later expanded on for the 1916 centenary, revealed that at least 130 students and graduates from that one school would participate in the 1916 Easter Rising. For a very brief period of time, the school was attended by a revolutionary of a different kind, Mr. James Joyce. Anya Ceannt recalled that her husband seemed to be a somewhat rebellious but very bright student. At this period, judging by his school diary, she remembered, Éamonn had a very definitive idea of what he should do and what he should not do. The young lad that emerges from Ceannt's school notebook is bright, ambitious, and very future-focused. A good school education, he writes, is all the more important for a young person about to embark on his fortunes in the world, and it's absolutely essential to succeed. The more we know, the more we wish to know. We are never tired of getting additional knowledge after our school days are over. Some of Ceannt's contemporaries would insist there was nothing particularly radicalising about that school, but I'm more inclined to agree with Mary Gallagher, Éamonn's biographer, who spotlights how the Christian Brothers were exceptional during the 19th century for teaching Irish history in its own right. They did so from their own textbooks, which highlighted the themes of Irish resistance to English invasion, Irish suffering resulting from English persecution, Irish struggle against English oppression. It's not for nothing, to my mind, that 130 kids from one school go out and fight in an armed rebellion. I think there's a lot of similarity between the young Edward Ceannt and a man we spoke about on the last edition at some length, the playwright Sean O'Casey, because like O'Casey, Éamonn had a brother who enlisted in the British Army and would fight in the Second Boer War. No less than 28,000 young Irishmen would fight against the Boers in that conflict. And O'Casey would write in his own memoir about the really curious feeling that war invoked in him. He writes in the first person, Johnny's whole world was divided against itself. England was at war with the Boer republics. His brother Tom had been called up, had been dressed in khaki, helmet and all. And similarly to O'Casey, it seems that a young Ceannt, as he still was, had confused feelings about this war. For young people, it was exciting stuff. One contemporary remembered, heavens, what thrills we got from that great struggle. Bonfires in the street on the news of a Boer victory. Complete disbelief in Boer reverses. The war had a radicalising effect on young people in Ireland. And looking at the amount of horses that won races named after Boer generals, it had a radicalising effect on adults as well. But young Edward Ceannt even asked his sister to make him a flag of the beleaguered Transvaal Republic. So I've always felt there were two things at the end of the 19th century that were radicalising young people in Ireland. The centenary of the 1798 rebellion and the war out there in the Transvaal. And for a young man of increasingly nationalist mindset, there were questions, I think, about employment paths he could take coming out of school. As his widow later remembered to the Bureau of Military History, he refused to enter the civil service on the plea that it was British, but he consented to enter for the Dublin Corporation, remarking that the funds for the corporation came from the citizens of Dublin. And in this his feelings were correct. Not only was the corporation funded by the citizenry of the city, but it was a body that was pretty nationalist by then. It had a significant Fenian presence within it, and with the emergence of the townships in 19th century Dublin, most famously Rathmines, there had been a kind of exodus of the politically unionist out of Dublin city, leaving Dublin between the canals, a city facing many, many challenges, with a corporation that was becoming greener all the time. And employed from 1900 as a clerk in the city treasurer, estates and finance office, his office was located on Cork Hill, immediately adjacent to Dublin Castle. There's a little plaque there on the city rates office just across from City Hall. He was diligent, Anya recalling how Éamonn was never known to be late for an appointment. And in the years that he worked in the corporation, only once was he late. And that was a day on which he'd started from home on a bicycle and a storm blew him off it. Within the Dublin Corporation, there was considerable enthusiasm for the Gaelic revival on all fronts. There was a healthy sporting and musical culture, as well as, many adherents of the Irish language. And Ceannt himself, it seems, joined the Gaelic League before even taking up his position with the corporation in 1899. Thankfully, we can chart Éamonn's involvement in the Gaelic League very clearly through his near constant presence in the newspapers of An Clive Solas. the newspaper of the Gaelic League, and he clearly displayed a strong commitment from the very beginning to the administration and the functioning of the League as a vehicle for change. Everyone wanted to learn the Irish language, but nobody wanted to do the administrative work, the bookkeeping, the cleaning up, all of that. I think the historian Anne Matthews captures the broad, sweeping power of the Gaelic League, writing that it attracted bishops, priests, students, teachers, civil servants, post office workers, policemen, tradesmen, and labourers. In other words, it was a movement that was open to all. And Éamonn Ceannt described it perfectly. After the Parnell split, there was no interest taken in politics by the young folk. There were too many divisions. The Gaelic League, where there were no politics spoken, was a mecca for everyone. The people learned that they had a country with a language. They learned the music, the dancing, and the games. Éamonn Ceannt, born Frances Mary Brennan, was in some ways the embodiment of the Gaelic League ideal, a movement in which women could move through the ranks and had a central place. She came from a family in which she and her sisters were all active across the broad spectrum of Irish nationalism. And thankfully, the papers of her sister Lily O'Brennan in the National Library of Ireland today, just an incredible collection of papers that give real insight into this time. Another sister, Kathleen O'Brennan, was in the United States at the height of the Irish Revolution and was clearly a political radical, aligned with the industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies trade union. While in Portland in 1918, most of the Irish agitation happened on the other side of the US. But in Portland, a US attorney would describe her as not only engaged in spreading Irish propaganda, but also the daily concert of IWW leaders and speakers in this city. So the O'Brennan girls certainly played their role in the Irish Revolution broadly. Married in 1905, Anya recalled that she and Éamonn tried, insofar as possible, to live their lives by the Gaelic League ideal, that Irish should be a living language. So, as she tells it in a biographical sketch of her husband, when his son Ronan was born in 1906, Éamonn Ceannt insisted on having the baptism in Irish and also registered the birth in Irish. This created a furore, and many letters passed between the registrar and himself, but Éamonn held to his point and insisted on the Irish. To show the anti-Irish feeling that existed, suffice it is to say that the post office refused the lodgement from Éamonn because he was giving his name in Irish. He never lay down humbly under any of these reverses, but fought them on to the bitter end. And these battles, we talked about them on the last edition of the podcast, from the postal service to Irish language shop fronts. These were all small things, but they were very significant in their own way. When you put them all together, they were about your day-to-day life. And for the Ceannts and their fellow activists, I think it was fundamentally a question of respect. But within the Gaelic League, there wasn't always complete agreement on cultural questions, something that came to the fore in a spectacular style during the 1907 disturbances at the Abbey Theatre, which marred the Playboy of the Western world. In the pages of An Clive Solis, there was a lot of debate on that play, but it opened up questions more broadly about the nature of what was happening in Ireland. For Ceannt, it was simple. On the question of the Gaelic League attitude, he insisted, "I protest we have no time to waste on Anglo-Irish poets, dramatists, or literature. Their time has gone. Let the Gael have the field henceforth." In reply, Patrick Henry Pearse insisted that the Gaelic Leaguer who confines himself to Irish, if there be any such, does not appreciate the full extent of the present-day literary movement, nor would the Gaelic Leaguer confining himself to Irish and English. But if there's an expression of the revival moment that Ceannt is most synonymous with, it's music. Indeed, Maurice Brennan, one of those interned with Ceannt after the 1916 Rising, remembered him not only as a very striking man in terms of how he carried himself, but as someone synonymous with music.
Could you tell us what kind of a man Ceannt was, in appearance?
Well, he was a very fine-looking man, well-built, very dark eyes, he had a moustache, and he was a man that you stand to look at if you saw him on the street. Of course, he was well known in Dublin because he used to play the bagpipes and in various other Irish Island functions. But he was certainly a splendid figure.
Anya recalled how in the corporation at this time was a man called Patrick Nally, who was interested in the Irish pipes, the Union or Uilleann pipes, and Éamonn contacted him, as he, like the other members of the Kent family, was intensely musical. Éamonn played both the fiddle and the whistle beautifully. Mr. Nally arranged for Éamonn to purchase a set of these pipes, and he at once began to study them. At the time also, Éamonn spent all his holidays in the west of Ireland, where he met Martin Riley, the blind piper. Many people in the Gaelic League travelled into the west of Ireland because they wanted to improve their spoken Irish, but Ceannt was part of a much smaller group travelling to the west of Ireland to hear music. And coming to Beebury, the Pipers Club, which he was a founding member of, represented a really important moment in the history not only of the uilleann pipes, but the meaning of the instrument. Just as the harp had come to be the symbol of the United Irishmen in the 1790s, Ceannt and others came to see the uilleann pipes as a defining part of the revival of their own time. And he made that direct comparison himself. He wrote, "In 1792, a meeting of the great Irish harpers was held in Belfast. It was said that within a year from that date they had all died. The pipers of Ireland are few, the good pipers are fewer, and the great pipers have all but gone." In other words, it's time to save this instrument. As William Henry writes, Ceannt's dedication to this organisation included buying a printing press. I mean, that's no small investment, on which he printed a journal on Peterborough, with the first edition appearing in July 1901. At the first AGM of that movement, the second agreed rule of the club insisted Irish shall, as far as possible, be the official language of the club. The centrality of that new club to the fortunes of the uilleann pipes in Dublin is very clear, but Ceannt was also a great proponent of the war pipes, or the bagpipes, playing them on the streets in Gaelic League processions, and even taking them to the extraordinary setting of the Vatican. When members of the Dublin Corporation travelled to the Vatican in 1908, marking the 50th anniversary of the Pope's ordination to the priesthood, Ceannt was present and would perform. Sean T. O'Kelly, who was then a councillor with Dublin Corporation, but later the President of Ireland, remembered how there were, I think, 400 or 500 pilgrims who came from all parts of Ireland. And the historian Dahi O'Coran paints quite the picture of Ceannt on that visit, which situates the war pipes and their marching place brilliantly. Ceannt marched the length of the hall playing O'Donnell Aboo. When the playing ended, the Pope, who took a personal interest in the cultivation of music, directed Ceannt to come forward so that he could inspect the pipes, after which he asked him to play another short air. Appropriately, Ceannt played The Wearing of the Green. In a very simple but powerful way, he demonstrated Ireland's distinct national identity. In the later War of Independence, Tom Barry would recall how the best of soldiers will fight even better still to the strains of their traditional war songs, and the harsh, wild music of the bagpipes would have a demoralising effect on the enemy. And so, the war pipes or the bagpipes would be heard in Cork at the Crossbarry ambush directed by Tom Barry. So in its own small way, that was a tribute of sorts, I suppose, to Ceannt and those around him who put the pipes centre stage. But an aspect of Éamonn Ceannt's life that's largely overlooked is the fact he was a trade unionist, active within the Dublin Municipal Officers Association. You can probably tell with a name like that, it wasn't a particularly radical union. It would become more radical in the aftermath of the 1916 Rising, and was vitally important in breaking the connection between Westminster and local government across the island of Ireland. But he was a radical voice within what was still quite the conservative union in his own time, and he was a consistent friend of what we might call the new unionism, embodied by people like Larkin and Connolly. In the pages of Sinn Féin, he would clash with Arthur Griffith repeatedly on the question of workers' representation and the right of workers to organise themselves. And as the historian Desmond Greaves wrote, he urged that Sinn Féin should encourage Irish trade unionism and not insult it at every opportunity. He was a member of Sinn. I don't know where he found the time to do all of this, but he was a member of Sinn Féin, and he was certainly on the left flank of the party. And he was ahead of many others in recognising the importance and the national significance of trade unions. In 1911, 2 years before the lockout in Dublin, the same thing happened in Wexford, an organised lockout of unionised labour by employers. And Ceannt brilliantly attacked Arthur Griffith on the question of labour in the Sinn Féin newspaper. "You appear," Ceannt wrote, "to see Larkin as at the bottom of the trouble. You do not condescend to analyse any of the principles for which Larkin professes to stand. Sufficient for you that Larkin is an agitator causing trouble between employer and employed." In a similar manner, the English Tory and his Irish allies describe Irish politicians as vile agitators who cause trouble between the good, kind landlords and their willing slaves, the tenant farmers of Ireland. But more than anything, Ceannt defended the right of workers to organise themselves into whatever kind of union they saw fit. More serious, he told Griffith, than your cold shouldering of the Wexford men is your practical denial to them of the right to join a particular trade union. Do you seriously hold that the employers of Wexford have the right to dictate whether their men shall or shall not join a particular union? That appears to be the point at issue. Taking that to be the cause, my sympathies go out unreservedly to the men. The right of free speech, of public meeting, and of organising for a lawful purpose ought to be unquestioned and unquestionable. The particular brand of union which the men shall join, be it a social union, political union, or a trade union, is a matter entirely for the men themselves. Neither the editor of Sinn Féin nor the employers have the right to dictate to them on that point. So much as he had done with Patrick Pearse when he disagreed with him on questions of English language literature in the Gaelic revival, it was evidence of Ceannt's confidence in expressing his opinions publicly, even when they were at odds with the editorial line. And I certainly think that Ceannt's willingness to put his head above the parapet and say what he was thinking on any issue is one reason he was recruited into the ranks of the Irish Republican Brotherhood by Sean McDermott. McDermott, who would oversee the Fenian newspaper Irish Freedom, I think he recognised a fellow master propagandist in Ceannt in the way he wrote, in his seemingly endless output across the nationalist press. And as a member of the Fenians, Ceannt really did put his back to the wheel. In the Bureau of Military History, some people recall being brought to Ceannt's house in Dolphin's barn where they were quietly sworn into the Fenians. But it was within the Irish Volunteers that Ceannt as a writer came into his most powerful. On the question of the World War and the split which decimated the Volunteers, he wrote brilliantly. When the volunteer movement split in two, the vast majority supporting the British war effort, Ceannt wrote, "The newly created National Volunteers, who acclaim Mr. Redmond as their leader and their prophet, hold that Ireland, having obtained a promise of Home Rule, without recourse to force or violence, will do well now to depend once more on British promises. By becoming loyal to England, the great heart of the British public will be stirred, and a satisfactory amending bill will be forthcoming after the war is over." The fallacy of this argument is the assumption that England has ever, in fact, redressed an Irish grievance before the Irish people had made clear their determination to take the law into their own hands. He predicted tens of thousands of Irish dead on the battlefield. But if the volunteer movement was split, then it was important to keep shape on what remained of the Irish volunteers. And Ceannt was commandant of the 4th Battalion, in charge of an area that was beyond the south inner city, just beyond it in some cases, but included Kilmainham in Chicor, Kimmage, the South Circular Road area where he resided. You can actually really chart his life in that little part of the city. And it was an interesting district in its class composition because significantly both Guinness and Jacobs were major employers of men who lived in those areas, and both companies supported the First World War effort and provided incentives for their men to enlist in the war. So you had a huge amount of families in that part of Dublin who were directly dependent on men fighting in the war. Kimmage, then quite rural, was home to what history now recalls as the Kimmage Garrison, located in the grounds of Larkfield House, at the site now occupied by SuperValu on Sundrive Road. That very much became a training ground for the 1916 Rising. And you had significant numbers of men lodging there, men who had travelled from Manchester, from Birmingham, Glasgow, and other Irish centres in Britain, conscious that a rebellion could be just around the corner and wanting to play their part in it. Captain Ceannt, readers of the Irish Volunteer newspaper were told, in January 1915, has been visiting his companies during the week and is following up his tours with a conference of officers. Other acting commandants should get similarly busy. In other words, the paper was telling his equivalent across Dublin, step it up. The last time Ceannt played the pipes in public was on St. Patrick's Day, 1916. We spoke about the significance of that day on the last edition of the podcast. The volunteers paraded across the city of Dublin and across the island of Ireland. But in the immediate road to the Rising, as recounted by Éamonn Ceannt, it's fascinating as it revealed how even those closest to the signatories of the proclamation, their significant others, were not entirely abreast of what was planned. Anya knew something was in the works, but nonetheless remembered the 20th of April, just days before the Rising, and it sounds like a routine visit to friends. We arrived at St. Enda's, now closed for the holidays. We were admitted and sent out to the garden at the rear. It was a glorious morning. Sun shining, birds singing, fruit trees in full blossom, everything promised peace and plenty. In the distance, coming through a vista of trees, I noticed a young cleric approaching. He drew near, all smiles, and soon I was clasping the hands of Liam Mellows, disguised as a priest. He shook hands with Ronan, and I said to the child, "And at Nian to eh?" And he promptly replied, "At Niam." Then Miss Pearce and Pat joined us, and while the men chatted, she and I admired the greenhouses and the tree known as Sarah Curran's tree. Lunch was announced and we went into the dining room. But there was a quiet heroism in how she remembered the day of the fight. And with the chaos that surrounded the 1916 Rising, it was on again, off again, on again, off again. There was a constant flurry of visitors to their home at Dolphin's Barn. But when the decision to fight was definitive, she would recall it quite beautifully. Time was now passing, and Éamonn proceeded to collect his equipment. He had a lot to carry, a large bag full of ammunition, an overcoat, and a bicycle. I helped him to put on his Sam Brown belt. While dressing, I asked him how long he expected the fight to continue, and he replied, "If we last a month, day, the British will come to terms." Turning to Ronan, who was watching us, he kissed him and said, "Bannock Latta, Ronan," and the child replied, "Bannock Latta, Yaddy." "Now turn to Ara, Ma, to the Warreen," he asked. "Would you look after your mother?" "Turhi the Yaddy," said Ronan, and they parted forever. From nearby Emerald Square, just off Dublin's Cork Street, and near his own home, the men of the 4th Battalion set off that morning, many unaware that the moment had actually come. Patrick Mullen, one of them who gathered in Emerald Square, recalled how, "My company took over Jemieson's distillery in Marrowbone Lane. In the distillery, Captain Murphy addressed us, and for the first time we knew that a rising was taking place. I believe he told us that various buildings and offices were to be occupied by the volunteers. We were ordered to barricade the distillery as best we could. Ceannt himself sees the South Dublin Union, a very important location, sitting near to the Liffey, some 2 miles to the west of the GPO, and strategically very important for interfering with the Royal Barracks, that's Collins Barracks, the Royal Hospital Kilmainham, and Richmond Barracks in Inchicore, also overlooking Kingsbridge railway station, that's Euston Station to us, which they knew would be vital for any reinforcements sent to put down the rising. But despite its strategic importance, it was about as imperfect a location in other ways as is imaginable, being essentially a complex of workhouses and hospital buildings. And while the volunteers in the O'Connell Street area had to contend with the breakdown of law and order, arson and looting, here the presence of thousands of ill and impoverished people presented completely different challenges. While other parts of the city were largely quiet, the most intense fighting at the South Dublin Union took place early in the week of the Rising. The British made the decision to move against the garrison there, and unsurprisingly, given the scale of what was, an enormous labyrinth of hospital buildings, it became something of a game of chess, and the British did succeed in occupying parts of the ground of the South Dublin Union very early on. One of the first civilian fatalities, I should say, of the 1916 Rising was the very brave nurse Margaret Keogh at the South Dublin Union. The sheer horror of the Rising for the men of Ceannt's 4th Battalion would reveal itself in close combat, man-to-man fighting. In some of their outposts, there were accounts of grenades being thrown into and subsequently back out of buildings. It was at the South Dublin Union that Cathal Brugha, Ceannt's second-in-command, would take a number of bullets. Indeed, Brugha himself believed he would die at the South Dublin Union. A volunteer recalled hearing Cathal Brugha in agony shouting, "Éamonn Ceannt, come here and sing God Save Ireland before I die." He would live to fight another day. And Ceannt's family would spend the week of 1916 with Cathal Brugha's. For Ceannt, given the intense baptism of fire endured by his men at the South Dublin Union, and the fact that they'd managed to hold their own there amidst arguably the fiercest fighting of the week, there was heartbreak in the decision to surrender when news reached him. In fact, I don't think initially he even believed the order to be genuine. But in his final statement penned in Kilmainham jail before execution, he struck a note of defiance against that decision to surrender, although he nonetheless obeyed the order. I have, for the guidance of other Irish revolutionaries who may tread the path which I have trod, this advice: never to treat with the enemy, never to surrender at his mercy, but to fight to a finish. I see nothing gained but grave disaster caused by the surrender, which has marked the end of the Irish insurrection of 1916, so far at least as Dublin is concerned. I find myself in agreement with his biographer and descendant Mary Gallagher who described him as a highly intelligent, capable, meticulous bureaucrat turned soldier. And while revolutionary movements need their great orators, their lightning bolt figures, your Jim Larkins, you also need those people, those meticulous bureaucrats, as she put it. His devotion to every organisation he was a member of, advocate for the Gaelic League, as a musician, as a commandant, was remarkable. To me, the fact that burnout did not take hold of this man's life is evidence of something extraordinary in terms of his energy. I feel he's perhaps more deserving of credit for his social positions, not only as a trade unionist himself, but as a proponent of the right of workers to organise themselves, which was a big battleground in pre-1916 Ireland. And tragically, his prediction of the slaughter of the First World War was proven to be correct. A brother, William Ceannt, a member of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, was killed in action in France in 1917. No doubt the next time I pass through Éamonn Ceannt Park in Crumlin, I'll think of the extraordinary journey of Edward Kent to an Irish revolutionary.